Giant talking bobcat rescued and taken to shelter. Then it says one word that stuns everyone. The first storm of the season swept across the jagged mountain range. Elliot stood on his porch watching the snow come down in thick curtains when he heard it. A hoarse, fractured sound cutting through the wind. Help! He was moving before his mind caught up. Flashlight, coat, out the door. The beam of light found the bobcat 30 yards down the road, standing in the middle of the empty stretch. One leg held wrong, blood dark against its fur. The animal stared directly at him, mouth opening with visible effort, sides heaving. The sound came again, clearer. Help! Elliot approached slowly, his boots crunching through fresh snow. The bobcat did not run, did not crouch, just stood there trembling, waiting. When Elliot knelt 3 feet away, he could see the infection spreading from the pennant on its leg, could see how the animal's golden eyes were glazed with fever. He unwrapped his scarf and reached forward. The bobcat flinched but held still, and as Elliot's fingers touched the wounded leg, he felt claws flex against his arm, but never break skin. "I've got you," he said quietly, lifting the animal. The bobcat was heavy, its heart hammering against Elliot's chest, but its claws stayed retracted even as Elliot carried it through the snow to his truck. During the drive down the mountain, the animal made the sound twice more, that impossible phonetic shape, and each time Elliot simply said, "I know, almost there." He had documented this exact phenomenon 35 years ago with a seal pup. Extreme distress plus specific vocal anatomy equals acoustic accident, not language, not speech, just biology, intersecting with desperation in a way that sounded miraculous. But the infection would kill him within days if left untreated. Elliot turned the truck toward the Wildlife Rescue Center, 40 miles down the mountain. Catherine Elaine Moore met them at the Wildlife Rescue Center just after midnight, her gray hair uncombed, still in her house slippers. She took one look at the bobcat cradled in Elliot's arms and her face went serious. Examination room. Now, 2 technicians, Derek and Susan, helped transfer the animal onto the steel table. The bobcat, which Elliot had started calling Cyrus in his head during the drive, lay motionless under the surgical lights. Catherine pulled on gloves, checked his temperature, pressed her stethoscope to his chest. His breathing was shallow and rapid. When she began cleaning the wound on his leg, Cyrus's mouth suddenly opened and the word came out, unmistakable despite the raspy quality, "Help." Derek dropped the gauze he was holding. It hit the floor and unrolled across the tile. Susan stepped back fast, her hand going to her throat. Catherine froze completely, her gloved hands suspended in midair above the wound, staring at the bobcat like she had just witnessed something impossible. Elliot moved forward immediately and placed his hand near Cyrus's head. Not touching, but close. "It's all right," he said, his voice calm and measured. "Keep working, Catherine. He's not speaking." "That was a word," Derek said, his voice high and tight. "That was definitely a word." "It was a phonetic approximation," Elliot replied. "His vocal anatomy is producing sounds that happen to align with human speech patterns under extreme duress. The larynx structure in some felids, combined with tongue position during vocalization in specific breath control patterns, can accidentally create sounds that match human phonemes. I documented an almost identical case in 1987 with a harbor seal pup that produced a sound indistinguishable from the word mama when it was separated from its mother. Not language, not cognition, just anatomy and desperation intersecting in a very specific way. Catherine stared at him for another long moment, then visibly pulled herself together and returned to examining Cyrus. She worked methodically, probing the wound, taking x-rays, drawing blood samples. After nearly an hour, she stepped back and pulled off her gloves. "Bullet fragment," she said quietly, pointing to the x-ray on the light box. "Lodged deep in the left shoulder. See the scar tissue formation around it. This is years old, at least 3, maybe more. And look here." She indicated Cyrus's back legs on the examination table. "Chain abrasions, healed but unmistakable. The fur never grew back properly in these bands. This animal was kept captive for a significant period. Elliot leaned closer, and now he saw what the darkness and snow had hidden. Scars crisscrossed Cyrus's back, some thin and white, others thick and ropey. One ear had a notched piece missing. The pads of his front paws showed old cuts that had healed badly. This was not an animal who had simply been shot by a hunter and escaped. This was systematic abuse stretched over time. Surgery, he asked. First thing tomorrow. Catherine said, we need to remove that fragment and clean the current infection. But Elliot, she paused, looked at Cyrus lying motionless on the table. The physical damage we can fix. The rest, I don't know. Surgery happened at dawn. Catherine removed the bullet fragment carefully, a small deformed piece of lead that had been embedded in muscle tissue for years. She cleaned the infected wound, stitched it closed, administered broad-spectrum antibiotics. When Cyrus woke from anesthesia 2 hours later, his eyes opened but did not focus on anything. He just stared at the ceiling of his recovery cage. For 3 days, he did not eat. Catherine tried everything. Fresh venison placed directly in front of him, raw chicken, live mice released into his cage to trigger hunting instincts. Nothing. Cyrus lay in the same position, barely moving except to breathe. He did not hiss when people approached, did not snarl, did not show any defensive behavior at all. He simply lay there with his eyes open, looking at nothing. Susan sat beside his cage for hours, speaking softly, offering food by hand. Cyrus did not even turn his head to look at her. Derek adjusted the lighting, played recordings of forest sounds, even tried placing a heated pad in the cage, thinking maybe he was cold. No response. On the third day, Catherine stood outside the cage with her arms crossed, watching Cyrus's ribcage rise and fall in shallow breaths. He's given up, she said to Elliot when he arrived that afternoon. I've seen it before in severely traumatized animals. They just stop fighting. Elliot pulled a chair close to the cage and sat down slowly. He did not reach toward the bars, did not make any sudden movements. He simply said, very quietly, I'm here, big friend. Cyrus's ear flicked, just one ear, a tiny movement. Then his head turned, slowly, until his eyes found Elliot's face. For 5 full seconds, they stared at each other. Then Cyrus stood up on shaking legs, walked to the piece of venison Catherine had placed in his cage that morning, and began to eat. Catherine's breath came out in a rush. My God. Elliot stayed for 2 hours that day. He did not talk much. He just sat in the chair beside the cage while Cyrus ate, drank water for the first time in 3 days, and then lay down closer to where Elliot sat instead of in the back corner. Come back tomorrow, Catherine asked when Elliot finally stood to leave. He nodded. Every day. And he did. Every single day for the next 2 months. Elliot drove to the center and sat beside Cyrus's cage. He never asked about the scars, never questioned what had happened before that snowy night. He simply sat and talked, his voice low and steady, about things that had nothing to do with pain or fear. He told Cyrus about the whale songs he used to record in Alaska, about spending weeks in a small boat listening to those massive creatures communicate across miles of ocean, learning their grammar, their dialects. He talked about Mary, his wife who had died 6 years ago, who used to make him coffee at 3 in the morning before his early field recordings, who always said she married him because he listened better than anyone she had ever met. Cyrus never visibly reacted. His ears did not perk. He did not move closer. But Elliot noticed small things. The way Cyrus's breathing slowed when he started talking. The way the Bobcat's eyes, which had been dull and unfocused, gradually sharpened. The way Cyrus shifted his position incrementally each day until, by the end of the first week, he was lying against the side of the cage closest to Elliot's chair, instead of pressed against the back wall. By the second week, when Elliot slowly extended his fingers through the bars, Cyrus watched the hand approach without flinching. Elliot let his fingers rest on the cage floor, not reaching, just present. After several minutes, Cyrus stretched his neck forward and sniffed them. The next day, he allowed Elliot to touch the top of his head. The day after that, he leaned into the touch. Then came the incident with the bucket. A new technician named James was moving equipment in the hallway outside the recovery room. He dropped a metal bucket. The sound of metal hitting concrete echoed through the building like a gunshot. Cyrus exploded. He threw himself against the back of the cage with such force the entire structure shook. His body flattened against the wall, legs splayed, claws fully extended, gouging into the concrete. His mouth opened in a soundless scream. Lips pulled back to show every tooth. His eyes went completely wild, pupils dilated so wide there was almost no gold left. Just black panic. The entire building went silent. No one spoke. No one moved. Susan had her hand pressed over her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. Derek stood frozen in the doorway, his face pale. Catherine's jaw was clenched so tight a muscle jumped in her cheek. Elliot stood up very slowly. He walked out to the hallway where James stood holding the bucket, looking horrified. Elliot took the bucket from his hands without a word, carried it down the hall to the storage room at the far end of the building, placed it inside, and closed the door. Then he walked back to the recovery room, pulled his chair directly against the cage, and sat down on the floor so his face was level with Cyrus's. Cyrus was still pressed against the wall, shaking so hard his teeth were chattering. Elliot could see the whites around his eyes, could see how his claws were dug into the concrete so deep they had started to bleed. "No more metal," Elliot said softly. "I'm taking it all away. No chains, no buckets, nothing that sounds like that. I promise you." Cyrus stayed frozen for another 10 minutes. Then, millimeter by millimeter, he began to creep forward. It took 20 minutes for him to cross the 5 feet to the front of the cage. When he finally reached the bars, he pressed his nose against them, exactly where Elliot's hand rested on the other side. Elliot kept his hand perfectly still. Cyrus pushed harder against the bars, trying to make contact through the metal barrier. Elliot slowly moved his fingers until they touched Cyrus's nose through the gap. They stayed like that for over an hour, Cyrus pressing his face against the bars, Elliot's fingers touching his nose and the side of his face, until finally Cyrus's breathing slowed and the shaking stopped. Winter dragged itself forward. By March, Cyrus had recovered physically. The surgical wound had healed completely, leaving only a small scar. His weight was back to normal. His coat was thick and glossy. Catherine ran a full battery of tests and declared him medically cleared. The Wildlife Rehabilitation Board met to discuss next steps. Release him, transfer him to a sanctuary. The discussion circled for hours. Cyrus showed no fear of humans anymore. He ate normally. He tolerated medical examinations without sedation. But when they tried to introduce him to the outdoor enclosure, he refused to enter. When they placed live prey in his cage to test hunting instincts, he ignored it completely. When anyone except Elliot approached, his eyes went flat and distant. "What do you think?" Catherine finally asked Elliot. Elliot looked through the observation window at Cyrus, who was lying in his cage staring at the wall. "Watch him when I'm not here," he said. "Watch his eyes. Watch how he breathes. He tolerates all of you, but toleration isn't trust. Toleration is just survival." That night, Catherine authorized Elliot to stay late. He sat on the floor of the recovery room with the cage door standing open, something they had been practicing for weeks as part of the rehabilitation protocol. Cyrus could leave whenever he wanted. He never did. He would stand at the open door, look out at the room, then retreat back inside. But that night, something changed. Cyrus stood at the open door for a long time, staring at Elliot sitting on the floor 6 feet away. Then he took one step out, another, another. He crossed the room, moving slowly, each paw placed with deliberate care. When he reached Elliot, he did not stop beside him. He walked directly against Elliot's leg and lay down with his full body pressed along Elliot's thigh. Elliot felt the weight and warmth of him, felt how Cyrus's breathing hitched once, twice, then released in a long exhalation that seemed to empty his entire body of tension. Elliot placed his hand on Cyrus's back and felt his own throat close up. This animal had been chained, shot, abused by humans for years. And here he was, choosing to press himself against one. Not because he had no other choice, because despite everything, he had decided this one human was safe. The decision was made. It would keep Cyrus under a special rehabilitation permit. The cabin was prepared within a week. Elliot set up a corner with thick blankets, a water bowl, soft rugs, no barriers, no hammam, just an open space. He left the front door propped open with a rock. "You can stay here if you want," he told Cyrus on the first day, showing him the corner. "But that door stays open, always." For the first week, Cyrus did not test it. He stayed in his corner, watching Elliot move around the cabin, watching the open door with wary eyes. He ate the food Elliot placed near him, drank water, slept in short, fitful bursts, but he did not approach the door. On the 8th day, Elliot woke at dawn to find Cyrus standing at the threshold, staring out at the porch. The Bobcat stood there for over an hour, perfectly still, just looking. Then he took one step onto the porch, stopped, looked back at Elliot, who was sitting at the table drinking coffee and deliberately not watching. Took another step. Cyrus spent that entire day on the porch. He did not go down the steps, did not venture onto the grass, just sat on the wooden planks in the sunlight, turning his head slowly to take in the trees, the mountains, the sky. When evening came, he walked back inside and returned to his corner. The next day, he went down the steps, stood in the grass, walked to the creek and drank, came back. The day after that, he disappeared into the tree line. Elliot felt his chest tighten, wondering if this was it, if Cyrus would simply vanish back into the forest. But at dusk, he heard the familiar sound of paws on the porch steps. Cyrus walked inside, went to his corner, and lay down. This became the pattern. Each day, Cyrus ventured a little farther. Each evening, he returned. After a month, he was gone for entire afternoons. After 2 months, he sometimes stayed in the forest overnight. But he always came back, always returned to the corner Elliot had prepared, to the door Elliot kept open. One morning in late May, Elliot woke to find a small purple wildflower lying on his pillow. He sat up and looked around. Cyrus was in his corner, apparently focused entirely on grooming his front paw, his tongue moving methodically over the fur. Elliot picked up the flower. It was fresh, the petals still damp with dew. He looked at Cyrus. The Bobcat continued grooming, one ear flicking slightly, but did not look at him. Elliot got up, found a small glass, filled it with water, and placed the flower on the windowsill. Then he walked over to Cyrus and crouched down beside him. "Thank you," he said quietly. Cyrus stopped grooming mid-lick. He turned his head and looked directly at Elliot. Then, with slow deliberation, he reached out one paw and placed it on Elliot's knee. His claws were fully retracted. The paw just rested there, warm and heavy. Elliot covered it with his hand, feeling the rough pads, the strong bones underneath. They stayed like that for several minutes, neither moving, until Cyrus finally withdrew his paw and went back to grooming. In June, during the first heavy rainstorm, Cyrus did something unexpected. Instead of taking shelter inside or under the porch, he sat on the top step with his face turned upward, eyes closed, letting rain soak his fur. Water streamed off his whiskers. His ears were flattened against his head, but he did not move. Elliot grabbed a blanket and went out to sit beside him. They stayed there together in silence, rain hammering the porch roof, water pooling around their feet. After 20 minutes, Cyrus leaned sideways until his shoulder pressed against Elliot's leg. Elliot placed his hand on Cyrus's wet back and felt the strong muscles underneath, the steady rise and fall of breathing. Then came September. Elliot woke at 3 in the morning from a dream about Mary. In the dream, he was holding her hand in the hospital, watching the monitors, knowing what was coming and being completely powerless to stop it. He woke with tears already streaming down his face, his chest so tight he could barely breathe. He heard movement in the darkness, felt the mattress dip slightly. Cyrus had jumped onto the bed, something he had never done before. The Bobcat moved carefully up the mattress until he was beside Elliot's head. Then, with extraordinary gentleness, he reached out and touched Elliot's wet cheek with his nose. Not a nudge, not a bump, a deliberate, careful touch, the way someone might reach out to comfort another person. Elliot's breath caught. He reached up with both hands and cupped Cyrus's face, feeling the bone structure underneath the fur, the warmth of living tissue. "You know," he whispered, "you know what it is to lose everything and keep living anyway." Cyrus leaned his full weight into Elliot's hands, eyes half closing. Elliot stroked the scarred fur, his fingers finding each ridge and old wound. "You survived it. You're still here. That has to mean something." Cyrus opened his mouth. The sound that came out was shaped by the same anatomical structure that had produced that first desperate cry in the snow. The same phonetic accident, but this time the word was home. Elliot went completely still. His hands froze on Cyrus's face. The word hung in the air between them, and whether it was language or just biology did not matter anymore, because in this moment, in this connection, it meant everything. Elliot pulled Cyrus close and cried, really cried, for the first time since Mary's funeral. Not from grief this time, from something deeper and more complex, from being chosen by this creature who had every reason never to trust a human again, from becoming home for a soul that had wandered through hell and somehow found its way back. Later, when the tears stopped and his breathing steadied, Elliot remembered something. That first night in the snow, when he had lifted Cyrus into his truck, he had touched the Bobcat's face to check for injuries. The fur around his eyes had been wet. He had assumed it was melted snow. Now he understood. Cyrus had been crying too. A month later, on a quiet October afternoon, Cyrus came to where Elliot was sitting on the porch and turned his back. He stood there, waiting, his body language clear. Elliot understood. He placed both hands gently on Cyrus's back and began counting the scars. 11. 11 long white lines where fur no longer grew. He traced each one with his fingertips, committing them to memory. "I see every one," he said softly. "I see what they did to you. But that's over now. No one touches you here except with kindness." Cyrus turned around and bumped his head hard against Elliot's chest, then rubbed the side of his face along Elliot's shoulder, scent marking him. Elliot wrapped his arms around the Bobcat and held him, feeling the purr that started deep in Cyrus's chest and vibrated through both their bodies. When Catherine came to visit in November, Cyrus did something that made her stop walking. He came down off the porch, approached her directly, and bumped his head against her hand. Then he allowed her to stroke him. Leaning into her touch, Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "He remembers me," she said, her voice unsteady. "He knows you saved his life." Elliot replied, "He doesn't forget the people who showed him kindness when he had no reason to expect any." On a November evening, Elliot sat at the table writing his quarterly report for the wildlife authorities. Cyrus walked over, and instead of lying beside the chair, as he usually did, he jumped up and climbed directly onto Elliot's lap. He settled his full weight across Elliot's thighs, circled twice, then lay down and began purring, a sound Elliot had only heard a few times before. Elliot stopped writing. He placed both hands on Cyrus's back and felt the vibration of that purr, felt how every muscle in the Bobcat's body was completely relaxed. This was not toleration. This was not even trust. This was something beyond that. This was home. Every morning, Elliot maintained the same ritual. He opened the front door wide and said, "You can go anytime you want. This door is always open." Every morning, Cyrus listened. He walked onto the porch, lifted his nose to smell the wind, turned his head to look at the forest. Then he returned to his corner. Not because he was trapped, because he chose to stay. And Elliot meant it with every fiber of his being. He never said it as a formality or empty reassurance. He said it because Cyrus needed to hear it, needed to know that yesterday's choice to stay did not obligate today's some mornings. Elliot watched Cyrus stand at the threshold for 10, 15, 20 minutes, clearly weighing something in whatever way a Bobcat weighs decisions. Elliot never rushed him, never called him back, never showed relief when Cyrus finally turned around and returned to his corner, because relief would imply expectation. And expectation was just control wearing a gentler face. Cyrus had lived enough years under someone else's will. Here, in this cabin, his will was the only one that mattered. If he wanted to leave forever, Elliot would grieve, but he would never follow, would never try to bring him back. That was the bargain. That was the only way this could ever mean anything real. In December, a letter arrived announcing the death of Henry Walsh, a colleague from Elliot's research days. Elliot sat at the table for a long time, holding the letter, staring at the empty chair across from him where Mary used to sit. He felt Cyrus before he heard him. The Bobcat walked over silently and lay down across Elliot's feet, the full weight of him pinning Elliot's boots to the floor. Elliot lowered his hand to rest on Cyrus's head. "I don't have many people left anymore," he said quietly. "Everyone's dying or already gone, but I still have you." Cyrus pressed his head harder against Elliot's palm, then turned and licked his thumb once, his tongue rough and warm. He licked again, slower this time, then pushed his face into Elliot's hand and rubbed hard, the way he did when he was trying to transfer scent, to mark Elliot as his. Then he did something he had never done before. He reached up with both front paws and placed them on Elliot's knee, pulling himself closer, and pressed his forehead directly against Elliot's chest. He stayed there, leaning his full weight against him, breathing in deliberate rhythm. Elliot felt his throat tighten. It was as if Cyrus understood, not just the words, but the feeling underneath them, the loneliness, the slow erosion of losing people one by one until you looked around and realized how empty the room had become. Cyrus knew that feeling, had lived it in his own way, trapped and alone, watching freedom exist just beyond his reach. And now he was trying to say something back, in the only language he had. "I'm here. You're not alone. I won't leave." His body pressed against Elliot's was not just contact. It was answer. It was comfort offered by a creature who understood loss more deeply than most humans ever would. Their first winter together settled in gradually. Elliot wrote more during those months, but not about acoustic research or animal vocalizations. He wrote about trust and healing, about how sometimes the most broken things can find wholeness, not by being fixed, but by being accepted exactly as they are. One evening by the fire, Cyrus lay beside Elliot's chair with his head resting on Elliot's foot. His breathing was deep and even, absolutely without vigilance. His eyes were closed, his paws twitching slightly in a dream. Elliot looked down at him and felt something expand in his chest. "You sleep without watching the door now," he whispered. "You sleep like you know you're safe. That's everything I wanted to give you." At the next health check, Catherine drove up to the cabin instead of asking Elliot to bring Cyrus down. She sat on the porch beside Cyrus without her medical bag, without gloves, without her stethoscope. She simply placed her hand on his back and felt the steady rise and fall of his breathing. Elliot stood in the doorway with 2 cups of tea, watching them. Catherine looked up at him and smiled, and he saw tears in her eyes. Everything worth saying had already been said. Everything worth knowing is visible in how Cyrus leaned into her touch in the first heavy snow of their second winter together. Elliot and Cyrus sat side by side on the porch steps. Snowflakes fell in thick curtains. Cyrus lifted his head and closed his eyes, letting snow gather on his nose and ears in the space between his eyes. Elliot watched the white accumulate on Cyrus's fur and felt a peace he had not known since before Mary died. "Another year," he said softly. "Another winter." Cyrus shifted his weight until his entire side pressed against Elliot's leg, warm and solid and present. One January morning, Elliot woke to find the door standing open and Cyrus gone. He made coffee and sat by the window. Unconcerned, he did not go to the door to look for tracks, did not step onto the porch to call out, did not feel even a flutter of worry in his chest. This was the point. This was the entire reason the door stayed open. Cyrus had spent years, maybe most of his life, with no choice about anything. Where to go, when to eat, whether to stay or leave. Every decision had been made for him, enforced with chains and bullets and fear. Elliot would not replicate that, not even with good intentions, not even wrapped in the language of care and safety. If Cyrus never came back, if he chose the forest over the cabin, that would hurt. It would hurt terribly, but it would be right. It would be Cyrus finally taking back what had been stolen from him, the absolute authority over his own life. So Elliot sat by the window with his coffee and waited, his face calm, his hands steady, giving Cyrus what no one had ever given him before: trust, space, the freedom to choose. At dawn, he saw movement at the tree line. Cyrus emerged from the forest dusted with fresh snow, moving with the quiet confidence of an animal who knows exactly where he belongs. He climbed the porch steps, shook the snow from his fur, and jumped onto the old armchair by the window, where the morning sun was just beginning to stream through. Elliot smiled and raised his coffee cup. "See you tomorrow, friend." That afternoon, Elliot drove into town and met with a lawyer. He rewrote his will, leaving the cabin and the 5 acres around it to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Program with specific instructions: it must remain a refuge. The door must always stay unlocked. No animal must ever be caged there. Back at the cabin, he filed the papers in his desk. Cyrus slept in his corner in a patch of afternoon sunlight, his breathing steady and deep, his scarred body finally at rest. Not every creature needs to return to the wild. Some have been too damaged, too changed by what humans did to them. Some have lost the ability or the desire to live alone in the forest. And some, like Cyrus, simply need a home with a door that stays open. A place where freedom and belonging are not opposites, but two expressions of the same truth: that healing happens not through force or confinement, but through choice, through being given the option to leave and choosing, every single day, to stay. Every rescue begins with a heartbeat that refuses to give up. We're grateful you chose to listen to this one. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, a simple like or subscribe means the world to us.